So first of all, who I am. I'm an economist. I am fairly academically trained. I do fairly rigorous economics. I am probably not a person you normally talk to, but my role at CMHC is to try and identify what are the big picture problems with the housing system in Canada, try and communicate that, make sure that this is based on fairly rigorous data and analysis, and try and, as I said, communicate this to the media. So I attempt to do a lot of influencing, but I also I get involved in policy debates at a fairly high level. I don't go into the detail. I try and direct where things are going. So that's a little bit my background. As I said, I am probably not a person you normally talk to. But perhaps we should be having more conversations, that there is scope for improvements, which I think you can all contribute to. So as I said, and for all, well, I was going to say all of you who live in Canada, but if there are Americans in the room, I think this is a North American and perhaps even a global problem of housing affordability. Housing is a problem, particularly here in Toronto, Vancouver. A few years ago, I would be complaining about housing supply challenges, housing affordability challenges in Toronto, Vancouver. Now I'm complaining about housing affordability challenges in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, Halifax, and so forth. So it's becoming a Canadian problem, particularly over the last 5 years, but it's getting progressively worse. And the answer to this, based on a lot of CMHC work, a lot of CMHC analysis, is we need to improve housing supply. Yes, there is some stuff on the demand side, but the overwhelming need from our perspective is to increase housing supply, and to do that through all sorts of methods. And yeah. And as I said, the need for housing supply is quite widespread across Canada. These are numbers about how much additional housing is required beyond what will be built anyhow. So we have forecasts of how much housing will be built. This is additional housing on top of that if we are to return to affordability of pre-pandemic levels. Some of those numbers look very big, arguably. Some of the numbers in Toronto, in Ontario and British Columbia should be even bigger. It's also important to note that an additional 7,000 housing units in Nova Scotia does not look like big, but relative to Nova Scotia, this is a big number. There is a lot of lost housing affordability in Halifax, and so we need housing across the board. So my usual position, as I said, I talk to the, try and influence policy, try and influence where things are going. And my usual position is to complain about municipal regulations. I complain about development fees and how we need to improve and reform those systems in order to accelerate the process of building more housing. But there are broader challenges as well within the housing system, and I will get to that. And where I'm going is that productivity within the residential construction industry is a way of getting more housing, and there needs to be improvement on productivity in housing. And in a minute, I will explain what I mean by productivity. Again, as I said, my usual position is complaining about regulations at the municipal level. This is actual data from a joint survey between Statistics Canada and CMHC. The bar chart there is a relatively objective measure of regulatory burden at the municipal level. And as you see, Vancouver and Toronto approval delays are quite significant relative to other cities in Canada. And the line chart is a measure of affordability, or the lack of affordability. And obviously, the more regulated the system is, the lower the affordability level is. There is a similar study done in the US, so this is not unique to Canada. We actually copied the survey from the US, but it's a little bit more rigorous in Canada. So there is room to improve on the municipal side, but there are challenges as well within the residential construction industry. So as I said, productivity is a rather difficult concept sometimes, or there are multiple definitions of what productivity is. Productivity for an economist does not mean firing everybody. Oops. I got too enthusiastic there. Oh. Wow, this is sensitive. Or there's a lag. Anyhow, where I was going is productivity means getting more output per hour worked. Right, so what it means is training, better training for workers, getting more better business techniques involved, getting more equipment, getting additional investment. So productivity, to be clear, does not mean firing people. What it means is working smarter, working with more equipment, better techniques, and so forth. So, as I said, this appears to be a challenge, particularly in Canada. Those of you who have, I'll take this up to the macro scale for a moment. Canada has a productivity problem. I was writing papers 20 years ago saying that Canada had a productivity problem for the previous 20 years. So productivity is a problem in Canada, but productivity in the construction industry is in particular a problem, although not that bad internationally, oddly enough. But there's also been a very sharp decline in productivity since the pandemic. This is one measure of productivity. It's how much housing starts there are for every residential construction worker. It's a measure, but it's just showing you that trends are going in the wrong direction. Now, there are always issues with data, so it may be that the housing is of better quality, etc. So you have to always take the data with a grain of salt. But there is a fairly consistent pattern of challenges in residential construction productivity. This is another way, and again, this is a more sophisticated metric, but using Statistics Canada data. The top line there is productivity in manufacturing. The bottom line is productivity in residential construction, and the middle line is productivity in all of construction, which includes infrastructure and commercial and so forth. But this seems to be part of a global pattern. I'll skip this slide. So again, I didn't realize there would be US people in the audience. So this is a comparison of Canadian and US productivity in residential construction. Canada, oddly enough, is not doing too badly relative to Canada. Canada is not doing too badly relative to the US, but as you can see, it's pretty flat. And there is US concern about productivity in residential construction. This is a very influential paper done in the US by a guy who's now head of the Federal Reserve in Chicago. So there is concern, and given the size and the scale of the residential construction industry, given the importance of getting more housing supply, productivity in residential is becoming not just a North American concern, but also a global concern. So this is, again, the same data, slightly different, but this is European productivity in residential construction, and again, going in the wrong direction. Now, I guess where I'm going with this is, what are we going to do about it? And I see that in I'm not a specialist, obviously, in construction, but I've been looking at what's been happening internationally. And there are certainly moves in places like Singapore, the UK, France, and so forth to see what can be done to improve productivity. There's now more of a framework in the European Union to improve productivity in construction. So again, there's concern and an imperative to improve productivity in construction. So this is where those are, where I'm going is I'm transitioning a little bit from the facts, a little bit more of a diagnostic and trying to understand where we should go. And again, when I start to go in the should go, that's maybe where I need to turn to some of the expertise in the room here. So there is a role for government to try and change its policy framework, try and encourage more productivity. And so in order to do that, we need to dig a little bit, again, more into the data. Now, again, this is the advantage of using data like from Statistics Canada is we can form our comparisons with other industries. And it seems that residential construction is quite fragmented. There are probably sound reasons for that, but it also mitigates against economies of scale. There is also probably some degree of adverse policy frameworks here. So I hear, for example, that for prefab construction, there are different regulations for each municipality, which seems to counter the whole effort to get economies of scale. But there is limited R&D investment in residential construction. It's a very labor-intensive process, and I guess where we're going is there a way of trying to improve and change these practices? Just to, again, give you a sense of scale, these are data from Statistics Canada. All of R&D expenditure in Canada is about $30 billion. All of the construction industry, which includes residential, non-residential infrastructure, and all of it, spends about $185 million on R&D, which is similar in magnitude to agriculture. For comparison purposes, given the way StatsCan defines the numbers, the construction industry, 5–6% of GDP, manufacturing is about 12% of GDP. So you can see some of the scales of differences. Now, there are counter-arguments. So the construction industry buys a lot of equipment, and that equipment will embody R&D. So the main point is that there's not a lot of R&D in construction. So again, moving then, okay, so there's a problem. Where are we going on the policy side? What can the government do on the policy side, which is always a little bit challenging. Like I said, I've been involved for about 20 years complaining about productivity in Canada, and productivity in Canada is still pretty weak. This is not a political issue, it's just everybody complains about productivity in Canada. So solutions to this are not easy. Diagnosis is easy, but coming up with policy solutions that actually work is quite difficult. I would argue that there are probably three parts. One part is the policy and regulatory framework. Some part, and this is where going into some of the contribution of people in the room here, is the technologies, the investments that could be made in order to improve productivity. And then there are practices and business of what is happening within the residential construction industry. So on the regulatory, on the policy framework side, I think there's a lot of delays and problems with the regulatory system that need to be improved. The federal government is trying to help in that respect through policies such as the Housing Accelerator Fund, but probably more could be done. So could we move, for example, to a, shall we say, nationally consistent building code? Is that a good idea? Being a hardcore economist, I would argue also that we need better cost-benefit analysis on those regulations. Are those regulations, for example, really beneficial when you take a whole life cycle approach to these regulations? Anyhow, I think there are a lot of measures that the governments in the plural could be taking. And that now I'm turning to, again, people in the room. Are there better technologies? Can these technologies be adopted? As I mentioned earlier, international countries around the world are moving in this direction. Singapore is mandating BIM technology. I believe the same in the UK, particularly when building social housing. So I don't have any power of this, but for example, such CMHC programs such as the apartment construction loan program require BIM in order for projects to be submitted. So anyhow, there's a lot of ideas here about how better use of technology can be made. CMHC has had a lot of demonstration projects to see what can be done, but could more be done to experiment with new technologies and show what works. And again, moving into the industry itself, it seems to be a highly fragmented industry. Part of that is explainable. You can't have, I think it's difficult to have a prefab plant in Toronto and supply the material for Vancouver. I mean, transportation costs are high. So but this fragmentation of the industry does mean that economies of scale are very difficult to obtain. I was at a conference in Quebec City 2 or 3 years ago where this sort of first hit me when the lumber industry, the wood exporteurs de bois in Quebec were saying that all of their products were custom designed. So again, this, like coming from the economics perspective, economies of scale are quite important. And so can we do less customization and more mass production? So anyhow, there's a lot of ideas here. But again, coming from the economics perspective, I'm a little bit, there's a tradition, there has been a tradition in Canada of, well, the government could do this, the government could do that, and it never seems to have worked. So I think what is required is more of an effective policy framework to encourage experimentation and innovation by the construction industry. And the question is, how exactly do we do that? I think there is a role for government to mandate more digitization, encourage more digitization by the provinces and municipalities, although government does not have a huge successful track record when it comes to IT projects. So anyhow, there's a lot of scope here. Productivity growth in construction, residential construction is extremely important because we have a drastic need for more housing supply. Canadians are suffering with housing affordability. It's a coast-to-coast problem. I haven't talked about what's happening in the north, but there are challenges there as well. So we need more housing supply, more productivity, more investment, more R&D, more innovation, and more experimentation with new technologies. So thank you very much.